Hello, welcome to Transatlantic Book Fair, which is co-produced by the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America and the UK's Antiquarian Booksellers Association. And today's special program, which is 007, the Transatlantic Appeal of Ian Fleming's James Bond. My name is John Knott, and I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the ABAA. ABAA was founded in 1949 to promote interest in rare and antiquarian books and book collecting, and to foster collegial relations. After this program, please take some time to visit our virtual fair at transatlanticbookfair.com. It's open now and continuously open until 8 p.m. Mid-Atlantic time on Tuesday, July 27th. A couple housekeeping issues. We are recording this session and will be available at a later date on the ABAA YouTube channel. The session is also streaming live on Facebook. If you have questions, we encourage you to move your computer cursor to the bottom of the screen and write your questions in the Q&A section. The ABA headquarters team will help us with those questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to share a comment with all attendees, with all in attendance, please use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and to thank them for their participation today. Rebecca Bauman is the head of public services at the Lilly Library, the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Indiana University, and home of the online exhibition, Ian Fleming and the World of James Bond. They are also an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Information and Library Science at IU, and a research interest center on the history of pulp, paperback publishing, and popular genres, including horror, science fiction, and romance. Ajay Chowdhury. For over 2 decades, Ajay has consulted on various motion picture, music, publishing, television, and theatrical projects, as well as being the associate producer on 2 feature films. In 2015, he co-wrote the internationally best-selling book, Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond filmed with Matthew Field. He also acts as a spokesman for the James Bond International Fan Club. Our host is my friend and colleague, Jon Gilbert. Jon is the official bibliographer of Ian Fleming, creator of the fictional character James Bond. A longtime member of the firm Adrian Harrington Booksellers, he is an internationally renowned dealer in rare Fleming material and a member of the Ian Fleming Foundation, becoming perhaps the foremost expert on the works of Ian Fleming. In 2012, after 4 years of researching his work, Ian Fleming, the Bibliography was published. It was the winner of the 16th ILAB Breslauer Prize for Bibliography, awarded in 2014. Jon, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Nice to see you. And welcome to Panelists. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Appreciate you tuning in. So I'm going to start today, really, we're just going to give a brief history of our own backgrounds, the 3 panelists. So I will kick off. I'm a writer, a bibliographer, and a rare bookseller. As John mentioned, I've been working for Adrian Harrington for over 30 years now, actually. Makes me feel rather old. So I've got quite a lot of experience of book fairs and book selling. It's a great shame that our book fairs aren't happening in reality at the moment, but it's good to do these things virtually. And again, I would echo John's words. Do feel free to check out the book fair at the Transatlantic Book Fair website. So at Adrian Harrington, we deal in rare books in many fields. My specialist area in particular is crime fiction and thrillers, and especially the works of Ian Fleming, who of course is the creator of the fictional character James Bond. As such, I've been fortunate enough to handle a wealth of extremely important material over the years. This would include typescripts, some manuscripts, proof copies, letters, autographs, signed and inscribed books, association copies, which are presentations of copies to friends, colleagues, people that have an association with the author. So it's not just a book that's presented perhaps to somebody unknown to the author at a book signing or a happenstance event. This would be, a book inscribed to his mother or his brother or somebody he worked in naval intelligence with earlier, that sort of thing. So important association copies I'm particularly interested in. And then there's things like rare photographs. Even the paperbacks have become quite scarce and sought after. The first editions are so valuable they can be out of reach for many of us, and that's pushed the paperback market. I also have dealt with some associated film material, film posters, British and American UK one sheets, and then the US, sorry, the UK quads, that's the landscape format, and then the US one sheet, which is a portrait format, with all those wonderful film artworks that promote movies, lobby cards, film scripts, which are very important and have a real interest for me, because they're the bridge between the author's published book and what you see on screen. And that's a very complex process and a very interesting process, and one that is really building in terms of collectability. Over the years, our firm has worked closely with the publisher Queen Anne Press, and also the literary journal, The Book Collector. Both of those organisations or companies were managed by Ian Fleming in the later years of his life. I've also had dealings with Ian Fleming Publications. That is the literary company that Ian Fleming set up to protect his literary interests, really. It was originally known as Glidrose. It's now Ian Fleming Publications, and they look after all the sort of literary aspects of James Bond and the other writings of Ian Fleming, because it's not just Bond that he created as the wonderful character Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which many people don't know or may have forgotten about. But if creating James Bond was one thing and a stellar achievement, he doubled that by creating Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which has had a film and a life of its own. And there have been sequels to that, as there have been with the, and there's a proof copy there of the first Chitty Chitty Bang Bang installment. It was published in 3 separate books in 1964 to 5 in the UK. It was published as an omnibus in the US in 64 by Random House, and that's a great book. That was written for his son Caspar. They were bedtime stories. When Ian had to take it easy, he was recovering from a heart attack and was recuperating at home, and spent the time, writing these wonderful stories that he'd made up for his son. So that's kind of my introduction, really. As John said, my bibliography came out in 2012, where I really just put down all the information I had to hand, and had found out about the first editions and the other, published works of Ian Fleming. And I was so pleased that it had a wonderful, there was a wonderful reaction to it and feedback. And I continue to write and, essays and other books on Ian Fleming. And I'm always happy to talk Ian Fleming to my customers or to friends and colleagues at book fairs and on panels like this. So that's me in a nutshell. I will hand you over to Rebecca Bauman.
I won't take up too much time and add much to John Knott's introduction to me already. I'll just add that as a librarian at the Lilly Library, I am one of the people who has the privilege of caring for and sharing Ian Fleming's book collection, as well as the original typescripts for the James Bond novels. So I've been teaching with these collections, sharing with these collections for about 10 years now. And, as well, my own research and writing is in pulp fiction, paperback collecting, and you really can't get into 20th century pulp without encountering Fleming and Bond. So he does cross my path in various ways from time to time, and I'm excited to show you all a few items from Fleming's collection and talk a little bit about how that was formed and how it ended up in Indiana, of all places.
Thanks, Rebecca.
I'll turn it over to AJ.
Oh.
That will help. Hi, everyone. It's an honour and privilege to be on this panel. I feel somewhat of a fraud as I'm not a sort of well-known book dealer or collector. However, I'm a big Ian Fleming fan and have been so since I entered into the world of Bond through the films. I always think watching the Bond films is like going to high school, but discovering the literary Bond is like going to university. And the wonderful opportunity the literary Bond affords us is something that's slightly forgotten these days, where the film tail wags the dog of the literary character. What I'm going to talk about eventually is how the Bond films eventually got made and the circuitous route that Fleming, whose books were amongst the biggest selling books of their time, why it took so long. I'm a lawyer by trade and have dealt and deal with film development and production and copyright. And I've also dealt in all sorts of areas of rights in music and theatre. I was a James Bond journalist writing for various magazines and websites for 20 years. And at some point I ran a James Bond journal for a few issues called Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, which focused on the literary and the film sites. I was proud to produce the first work on Ian Fleming's State of Excitement, his banned book in Kuwait, and also a wonderful bit of literary detective work on Per Fine Ounce, the book, the non-Fleming James Bond continuation book, which has a mysterious history. I then, in 2015, with my best-selling co-author Matthew Field, wrote an 800-page, fully annotated book on the history of the James Bond films called Some Kind of Hero, the remarkable story of the James Bond films, which was received extremely well. We've gone into second edition and hopefully working on more volumes when and if the situation calms down. I'm a frequent shopper and habituate Adrian Harrington's wonderful bookshop in London when it was there, and John has hosted some lovely events. And my dream one day is to visit the Lilly Library at some point and see the books that changed the world. But thank you very much for allowing me on here.
Thank you, Ajay. Yes, I'd forgotten, well, not forgotten, but I just didn't mention the events. So thank you for reminding me. Adrian Harrington, we've always sold not just the Ian Fleming books, but the continuation books. You may not be aware out there, but there have been many authors who have written James Bond books after Ian Fleming. Some, all highly respected, but some very big names among them, including Kingsley Amis, Sebastian Faulks, William Boyd, and currently Anthony Horowitz. And a good friend of AJ and ours, Raymond Benson, held the hot seat for a number of years in the 90s and 2000s, and we had book launches at our shop and lovely events. That's where I first met you, AJ. That was probably 97 or 98.
Yes, I think so.
23 years ago. There we are.
And
we had some wonderful guests,
yes,
biographers and people from the publishing house, and some celebrities. I think we had
Jethro Tull, didn't you? You had
yes, that's right. Ian Anderson's son came, and anyway, I could chat about that all day long. What I'm going to do for today, to start with, is I've decided to give my brief biography of Ian Fleming. A lot of people tuning in will already know an awful lot about Fleming. Certainly everyone will know about James Bond, and will all have likely seen a James Bond film, but Ian Fleming tends to get a little bit overlooked or forgotten about when it comes to Bond. And I want to perhaps redress that a little bit. So I will give you a brief background to Ian Fleming and why I find him such a fascinating person. And this will sort of touch upon how the books came about and that sort of thing. So I'll just start now. He was born in Mayfair in 1908. Ian was one of four sons of Valentine Fleming, Major Valentine Fleming. Ian was the second child. He was the younger brother of Peter Fleming. Peter would go on to be a very well-respected travel writer, explorer, and adventurer. Some would say very much a model for James Bond. They were all schooled at Eton College in London. And after that, Ian continued his education at universities in Geneva and Munich. And he finished his sort of formal education at a rather sort of almost libertine finishing school in Austria. where his writing really developed, was encouraged. This was a sort of an avant-garde school run by Ernan Forbes Dennis and Phyllis Bottom, the novelist, who is possibly forgotten these days, but she was a popular thriller writer in her own time. And Ian started writing escapist stories and adventure stories there. So it's quite an important time in his life. He was a German speaker, and he knew other European languages as well. He spent a lot of time in Europe. And much of his experiences go into the Bond books. So the travels, the settings for the Bond novels, the places that Bond is at. Fleming knew those places. He was there. The types of car that Bond drives, Fleming would have driven. The experiences Bond has, skiing, hill climbing, scuba diving, or skin diving. You know, Fleming did all of that. So it's very much a lot of Ian Fleming in James Bond. As I mentioned, his parents were Valentine Fleming and Eve Fleming, known as Mrs. Val. Sadly, Major Valentine Fleming, who was a colleague, a friend of Winston Churchill, he was killed in the Great War in May 1917. After which Mrs. Val brought up the boys very much on her own. She eventually had another relationship with the painter Augustus John, and she had a daughter, Amaryllis, by him, Ian's half sister, and Amaryllis became a very famous musician, a concert cellist. After his education, Ian went into stockbroking and merchant banking, and it's very fair to say he was hugely unsuccessful. He even said that himself. Around this time, he started book collecting, and really his best investment was nothing to do with stockbroking or that. It was the collecting of books, important works on all sorts of subjects, but these were books that made things happen. These were ideas books. So key books in certain fields: science, nature, natural history, voyages and travel, all sorts of things. And Rebecca will expand upon that in great detail, because Ian's very important book collection ended up at the Lilly Library, as we know. In fact, it was deemed so important that it was given safe storage at the Bodleian Library during the Second World War, when London was being bombed, and Ian's home in London was obviously under threat. So that important collection was removed to Oxford. I suppose his first great success was as a journalist with Reuters. He moved out of stockbroking and started copywriting, and he went on the odd assignment. He did do some work in Russia, and he was doing all sorts of varied things. He was covering some motor racing, some alpine hill climbing. So again, a lot of experiences he was getting here. Then he was very much a sort of a lost soul in the 30s, a man about town, but hadn't really found his place. He would play golf, keen golfer. He would play cards of an evening, but there wasn't any real great purpose. And then the war came along, and he was recruited by naval intelligence. And this really is where he starts to flourish as not just a person, but as an organizer and a cataloging or putting down his ideas and really sort of taking hold of his life. He was working as the assistant to Admiral Jon Godfrey, who was the director of naval intelligence. So this was an illustrious position. Ian Fleming was employed as an ideas man. Some of the ideas he had were harebrained schemes to bring about, the downfall of the opposition. But he is also responsible for some very interesting ideas. There's been a lot of books written about those, things like Operation Mincemeat, which Fleming was involved with. I won't go into too much detail because you can check those out for yourself, and time won't allow. But he came up with some significant ideas to disrupt the the Nazi war machine and the war effort. He was also a liaison officer with other intelligence agencies. So this would include organizations like the British Security Coordination in New York, which was headed by Sir William Stevenson, the Canadian spy master, who was a Great War air ace. He brushed shoulders with some illustrious people, including General William Donovan, known as Big Bill, who was the head of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. As such, Fleming, he was sort of asked by Donovan to write a memo on how he could form an American Secret Service, because the British Secret Service, which was the naval intelligence, the Admiralty, was the most prestigious Secret Service, secret intelligence organization in the world. And so Fleming wrote this memo, which became a sort of blueprint, and eventually developed into the CIA. So Fleming was there, involved in the genesis of the CIA. He also had an audience with J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. He made the acquaintance of Alan Dulles, and was a friend of Alan Dulles, who read the Bond novels and greatly appreciated those. In around 1943, Ian Fleming headed Winston Churchill's auxiliary units, one of those. His one was number 30 Commando. Now, these were Marine commandos who were employed in sabotage, disruption behind enemy lines, covert missions. Ian himself was not a field operative. He oversaw operations from behind a desk in Whitehall, but he would debrief his spies, commandos, and again locked away a lot of their stories, adventures, which certainly crop up in the Bond books. Perhaps his finest hour was 30 Commando, or number 30 Commando AU. They were successful during the D-Day landings at Normandy, and they captured the entire German naval archives, which was the equivalent of the naval intelligence papers. So that was a major coup, and Ian himself, on a rare occasion where he did leave the office, he travelled over to northern France and supervised the safe passage to the UK of that Kriegsmarine archive. He left the war and kept the rank of commander. Post-war, he gained a job at Kemsley newspapers, run by his friend and card-playing partner, Lord Kemsley, which was James Gomer Berry. He had quite a cushy position, it's fair to say, within the Kemsley newspapers group. He was the foreign manager of the flagship paper Kemsley had, which was the Sunday Times. And Fleming managed to negotiate a 2-month holiday period every year, with which he spent at Goldeneye in around 1947, 46, 47. His great friend, a school friend, Ivor Bryce, who'd also worked in the OSS during the war. Ivor Bryce found Fleming a plot of land in Jamaica. Ivor Bryce had a house in Jamaica as well. And Ian built a lovely summer holiday home chalet, which he christened Goldeneye. And every year from the winter of 1952, he would write one of his novels there. While he was at the Sunday Times, he operated a network called the Mercury Service. And this was where the correspondents around the world would cable in their information or get their information to Fleming at the headquarters in Fleet Street. He employed people like Anthony Terry and Richard Hughes, and these had been effectively his naval intelligence colleagues during the war. Anthony Terry was stationed in Berlin, and Richard Hughes was in the East. He was in Hong Kong. And so effectively, he was having a peacetime network of agents, as he did during the war. And this ran very successfully and was the envy of newspapers and news services around the world. Then around 1952, on the eve of his marriage to Anne, he settled down and wrote what he called the spy story to end all spy stories. This had been burning away inside of him. All of these wartime experiences, newspaper assignments and that, he just had to get them out, put them into story form. And Casino Royale was the first of those, which was published in 1953. We have an image of the first edition Casino Royale, I believe. It was the first of 14 Bond books. They weren't all novels. There were 12 book-length novels, and 2 of those were short story collections, 9 stories in all. Some very famous ones, For Eyes Only and Octopussy, amongst them, The Living Daylights. I personally think he's an exceptional short story writer. Some of my favorite writings of Ian Fleming are his short stories. He was heavily influenced by Somerset Maugham, and if you're familiar with his works, fantastic short stories. He didn't just write the Bond novels. He wrote 3 other books. He wrote a travel book called Thrilling Cities, which was really based on his exciting adventures as a newspaper man. He wrote a true crime documentary called The Diamond Smugglers, and he wrote a children's book, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. He also wrote other essays and introductions to books written by other famous authors. And around this time, while the Bond novels were being written every year, he was trying extremely hard to get the James Bond series filmed, which AJ will expand upon in great detail in a moment. In 1954, the first real screen appearance of Bond was Casino Royale, which was televised in the US by CBS. Then Moonraker was adapted as a radio play in 1956, which was aired in South Africa. Now, whilst the Casino Royale feature-length television episode does exist, the Moonraker was broadcast live and was not recorded. So we don't have a record of that, sadly. Then there was a proposed television series for Bond, for which Ian Fleming wrote several of the outlines. After much stalling, the official film series burst to life in 1962. Fleming had teamed up with Harry Saltzman and Cubby Broccoli, the producers, and Dr. No became the first installment in their phenomenal movie franchise. Fleming sadly only lived to see 2 of those films, Dr. No and From Russia with Love. He was in pretty poor health. He was a very heavy smoker, and his lifestyle just caught up with him, I'm afraid. And he died in August 1964. He was aware of some of the success of Bond, certainly through the films, but he really didn't experience, what we know to be James Bond now, and this monumental thing that we're all fans of, and which is why we're here, discussing it. I would just finish shortly, but I would just like to say, if you want to know more about Fleming, I've not covered in great detail many facets of his life, but there have been several biographies written about Fleming, the first of which was by John Pearson, who was Fleming's number 2 at the Sunday Times. Fleming had a column. It was called the Atticus column, and John Pearson was his sort of junior journalist who really did a lot of the donkey work for the Atticus column, and he knew Fleming, very well. And he wrote the first major biography, The Life of Ian Fleming, which was published by Cape, who published all the Bond books. That came out in 1966. Pearson has written many other biographies as well, including, London Underworld. He's done a biography of the Krays. He's written biographies of Donald and Malcolm Campbell and the world speed records that they undertook. So, very much dark crime on the one hand, or boys' own adventures on the other side, on the other hand, so very much in keeping with the life of Ian Fleming. So I would recommend that. 30 years later, in the mid-90s, Andrew Lycett wrote a biography of Ian Fleming, which revisited the life of Fleming, has a different angle, is very well worth a read. Andrew again is another, you know, magnificent biographer. He's written a number of literary biographies, including Conan Doyle, Wilkie Collins, Rudyard Kipling, and of course Ian Fleming. So I would recommend you check those out to understand more about how the films developed and Fleming's input there. By all means, you know, look up AJ's book, Some Kind of Hero. So shameless plug, but in my bibliography, there's a lot of biographical detail of Fleming and a lot of people that he brushed paths with, so or brushed shoulders with. So the ones I've mentioned, you know, Bill Donovan, Sir William Stevenson, Ivor Bryce, they're all in there. So I'd recommend that. And then finally, just before we move on to Rebecca and AJ, there's a couple of upcoming books which I would like to recommend. Not published yet, but James Fleming, Ian's nephew, who runs the Book Collector, has been working recently on a fantastic aspect of Bond, a little touched upon aspect, which is Bond behind the Iron Curtain. So in the Soviet bloc, the Bond novels obviously were heavily censored. You know, Smersh and you know, the Red Army are the number one you know, villain in the Bond books, so it's no doubt they didn't get an airing there. But there were several sort of pirate editions or unauthorized editions in these countries throughout the 60s, and James has done a wonderful survey of these and an account of this, and that will come out soon, and at Adrian Harrington will be, you know, stocking copies of that. And finally, it's now been 30 years since Andrew Lycett's you know, fantastic biography of Fleming. So there's another full-length biography of Fleming in the works, which is, you know, fully supported by Ian Fleming Publications. I was interviewed for the project a couple of years ago now, before the, you know, before the pandemic. But that really is, I don't think I'm at liberty to give more information than that. But it's from a highly respected biographer who has written biographies of Churchill, has looked at secrets of state, that sort of thing. So he's very much in the position to write about espionage and the life of Ian Fleming. So I shall really be looking forward to that one. Don't have a title or a date for that. As I say, I'm not really party to allowing you the author's name, but watch this space, as they say, and when that comes out, I will certainly have copies of that. So that's me done and my potted history of Ian Fleming. I will hand over to Rebecca, who's going to chat about the novels in more detail, particularly the manuscripts and the book collecting side of Ian Fleming. So Rebecca, over to you.
All right, thanks, John. So Fleming really only collected for a couple of years. He started in 1935 and wound it up in 1938. Very short period of time, but his book collection he was very, very proud of, and he talked about it a lot. And I think that it kind of helped him build the persona that he wanted to have. In Who's Who, he listed his hobbies as golf, cards, spearfishing, and first edition collecting. And I'm going to read how he described his collection. This is from an interview that he did that was published in Playboy in 1964. And I kind of love that in this relatively short interview, he spends a lot of time talking about his book collection, and this was 30 years after it was done. But the way that he describes it, he says, I decided I would collect books that signalized a right-angle turn in the world's thought on any particular subject, a book of permanent value in the history of the world. I began to think through every human activity from art to sports and physics and whatnot, and with the help of a great friend of mine, who I will talk about, we got out a tremendous list of the great books of the world since 1800. They go from Karl Marx's Das Kapital to Eli Cuthbertson's first book on contact bridge, which changed the bridge-changing world, books on everything. Fleming really deserves credit for the idea for his collection. He had this idea to collect books that started something, and that was a brilliant idea in the 1930s. This is in the middle of the Depression. The book market is in a very precarious state. People are still collecting first editions of literature. He didn't go that route, although there is literature in the collection, which I can talk about or answer questions about. But he kind of went on this different tack and was able to get books incredibly cheap. The prices on these books will, for those of you who are listening who are collectors, they will make you cry because they were so cheap at the time compared to what they are worth now. And he was able, with a very small amount of money and a very short period of time, to build a collection that has incredible lasting value, not just monetarily, but in terms of intellectual thoughts, in terms of learning from the collection, and thinking about what was considered important in his time. Now, he does deserve, as I said, credit for the idea. Most of the work was done by his friend Percy Muir. And he met Muir in the 20s. He was actually shopping for books, but not first editions, not old books. He was just looking for the new D.H. Lawrence. I think this was in 1929. And he was in the shop, Dulau's, that Muir worked in. They got to chatting, and they sort of struck up this just immediate and powerful friendship. It was only a couple of months later that Fleming was inviting Muir to go on vacation in Austria with him and having mountain climbing adventures and meeting interesting women. And they continued to talk about books and about what does first edition collecting mean? Why do people do this? Fleming told Muir, oh yeah, I collected cigarette cards and, things like that when I was a kid, but like I've outgrown that. And Muir was able to convince him that book collecting is meaningful and interesting. And Fleming had this idea and said, like, will you help me build this collection? So Muir did all of the work of identifying books that were important. First of all, he did lots of research into the history of science and technology. He especially wanted to get into areas that had not traditionally been collected, right? So science and medicine was being collected to some extent, but sort of some of these, like, the first printed mention of India rubber, things like that. Like nobody thought to collect this. The first caterpillar treadmill, things like that. So it wasn't just books, but also patents, scientific articles were part of the collection. And then other areas beyond science and technology, philosophy, economics. One of my favorite areas, and I think that things that people love to see is sort of sports and games. So billiards, golf, swimming, ping pong, cards, bridge, all kinds of things. And then some literature as well, which Muir was a little tepid on and Fleming kind of came to regret. But there's some interesting novels and poetry in the collection also. Probably the best way for me to share this collection with you is to actually share it with you. So I'm going to screen share and just show you a couple of things real quick. The first thing to note are the cases that the books are in. They are all in these black buckram cases, embossed with the gold Fleming crest, goat head, and the motto, "Let the deed show." Of course, we've put our library labels on them now. They have on the side a little band. You can't really tell with this camera, but that is a dark green. And they're sort of color coded by subject, although I have to say the colors are a little inconsistent. But Fleming really wanted the books to be, to look nice on the shelf and to be protected. Percy Muir everything that Muir writes about this collection, he always complains about these cases and how stupid they were, because they were in many instances quite a bit more expensive than the books themselves. I will say, as a librarian, I love them because they do protect the books. And, as far as sort of the wow factor, I love showing these. You always get that, like, excitement when, you can say, like, oh, this is the first edition of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Yeah, great, whatever. And then you're like, and it was owned by Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond novels. And people go, wow, that's so cool. And like, they love the motto, they love the crest, they love everything about it. So I fully support. Again, I also think Fleming was rather visionary in having nice, attractive cases for his books. They're lined with fleece, which is not great because it does get a little bit of browning. This one is just one of the books from his sort of sporting collection. It's the first book printed about golf. It's from 1857, The Golfer's Manual. It has a really lovely frontispiece here. It was published anonymously by a keen hand. This was Alan Robertson, who was one of, well, yeah, sort of gives it away there. Our copy is signed. Who was one of the foremost professional golfers in Scotland at the time. So this is I think a really special one in the collection because it kind of combines Fleming's interest in books with his interest in golf, and is, you know, just something that people absolutely love to see. Many of these books, as I say, were not expensive. You know, £2, £5. He got, I think, 9 Einstein titles for £10. He got Marie Curie's theses for £8. The most expensive book in the collection, it's really a pamphlet, not a book, is the first printing of the Communist Manifesto from 1848. Muir found a copy for him, knew it was something that belonged in the collection, pitched it to him for £100, and Fleming talked him down to 94, which I think is also truly a testament to these two men's friendship, that Muir didn't hold fast on his £100 price, which was a great price even at the time, but let him shave off £6. And this is the one that's appreciated greatly even at, you know, the time of Fleming's death, when, you know, the question of what would happen to this collection came up. This was the item that was worth many thousands of dollars already. So even within his lifetime, it was a wonderful investment. And Fleming was encouraged many times during his lifetime to sell the collection. He didn't really have it out. It was in storage most of the time, you know, so didn't really use it. Muir kind of complained, like, I know he never opened these cases and looked at these books, but he did not want to sell it. He saw it as a hedge against inflation and one of the best investments he'd made. So he never budged. I think he told Dave Randall, who was the first director of the Lilly Library and did end up buying the collection after his death. They corresponded when Fleming was still alive, and Fleming said, "You would need many sacks of gold to be able to buy this collection from me." Like, I know when he also said, "Is your university willing to sell its football field? Because that's what it would take." But Randall, and they had like a great correspondence as well. He was persistent, and, you know, he made it work eventually. We also have Fleming's personal copies of his novels. Now, of course, normally when you have a first edition, you prefer it to be in original condition, in jacket, but this is one case where, you know, something rebound is rather special. Fleming had all these rebound in Morocco to match the bound typescripts. Again, you can't really see the color. This is a really vibrant turquoise. And then the the typescript of Casino Royale is in matching Morocco. So they match, which I love. It's just a lovely touch. Not always first editions. So he never really absorbed the like vital importance of first editions. Sometimes they're later. Did have the jackets bound in. But what makes it amazing, of course, is his writing in it. So author's copy. And what this says is, this was written in January and February 1952, accepted by Cape in the spring, and published a year later. It was written to take my mind off other matters. This is underlined. It has a little asterisk, which goes over here, and I'll talk about that in a moment. At Goldeneye, Jamaica, the characters are not based on people, but some of the incidents are factual. The bomb trick was used by the Russians in an attempt on von Papen during the war in Ankara. I. Fleming. So lovely little, you know, that he's thinking about posterity, right, at this point, that maybe people will want to know in the future kind of how this came to be. When did I write it? Where did I write it? And he was also approached during his lifetime about selling his typescripts and selling these, and he wanted these to stay with the family. And then the family did decide to sell them, but they did stay all together, which is really nice. Now, as far as where the little asterisk goes, he obliterated this, but he didn't do a very good job. You can totally still read it if you look at it carefully. So what it says over there is other matters. Marriage, a chilling description, but revealing of the author's capacity for affection, love, and human relations. IF, June 12th, 1963. So this is sort of a delightful little mystery. It's unclear, did he add all of this in 63? Was this added in 63? Why did he add it and then scribble it out? And if you're going to scribble it out, why not completely, right? So it's, none of these questions are answerable, but it's just a wonderful kind of remnant of an author's thought process, and his relationship with his own works, and how that work was kind of inextricably intertwined with his personal life, his marriage, all of these other things. It's a wonderful thing. Love showing this in classes, love showing this to Bond fans. And finally, I'll show you, and unfortunately the document cam does not do this justice, because you can't even get the whole thing in. It's quite large. This is the bound typescript for Goldfinger that you can see right there. It's strapped right now because we're about to put it on exhibit. It will be in our, we've been under renovation for a couple years. It'll be in our reopening exhibition. The typescripts are, as many of you probably know, Fleming wrote incredibly fast, 2,000 words a day, just absolutely churned these things out in a couple of months. And if you look at the early typescripts, they have quite a few corrections. As you go on towards the later novels and stories, much, much, much fewer. We're kind of in the middle range here, where we have a decent amount of corrections, but not quite as many. So it does show, if you look at them, if you look through all of them, you see him gaining confidence as a writer. And this one, I love the first page, because you can see that he changed the title. It was originally Goldfinger, which is typed there. Then he changed it to The Richest Man in the World, crossed that out, back to Goldfinger. Also changed the title of chapter 1 from the after death to Death Leaves a Taste. The other thing I always like to make sure to point out in this one, and this is rare that he does this. He's usually very confident writer, typing, not adding or taking away large chunks, but occasionally he'll insert a scene that's done by hand. And this one is especially wonderful because it is the golf scene in Goldfinger. So knowing that that was a later edition, something that he thought of, afterwards, then has become this beloved, famous, wonderful scene, is really great to see. And we use these a lot, not just for the kind of, Bond fan show and tell, but we also use these for creative writing students here to learn about, writers' processes and compare to other writers and how they do things. So there are a couple of things, and I will wrap up now so AJ has time, but if you have questions about how the materials ended up here, we can talk about that in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was mouth-wateringly delicious. I hope to get there one day. So Jon and Rebecca have set up the story that I'm going to sort of continue with. Ian Fleming was an ambitious writer. Which other writer would, before his first novel was published, get a gold-plated typewriter made for him by the aforementioned friend Ivor Bryce? Which other writer in those days would form a limited company, Glidrose Productions Limited, and insert the copyright to his unpublished books into that? Well, Ian Fleming did. Ian Fleming wanted to be a success, and the tax laws in the UK at the time meant that it was better for him to put his copyright into Glidrose Productions Limited, which he did, and Casino Royale, and throughout all the Bond novels and short stories, the copyright is vested there. Fleming wanted his books to sell like Gone with Naked and the Dead, as he said in correspondence. He knew that libraries sold a lot of books, but movie cinemas sold more. And initially, he tried to get the books, or he understood the value of books being successful under media. Of course, they weren't incredibly successful, his books in the beginning, but almost from the get-go, people showed an interest in buying his books, optioning them for other media. In '54, MCA, the Music Corporation of America, has a sort of initial purchase of Casino Royale, which gets made into, as John and Paul mentioned, the 1954 CBS TV climax show starring Barry Nelson as card sense Jimmy Bond. Later on, a writer and actor called Gregory Ratoff options Casino Royale as a screenplay, and in fact tries to get a film made in the 50s, but to no avail. Fleming was touted as being one of the screenwriters on that. Nevertheless, Fleming plugged away, a book a year. Live and Let Die comes out in 1954, and Alexander Korda, the great Hungarian film producer based in Britain, has a snippet trying to buy the rights. In 1955, Moonraker comes out. Fleming felt this was a very filmic book. Ironically, the resulting film is nothing like the book, but John Payne tries to adapt or tries to get the book for the Rank organization. So throughout, we're seeing a lot of interest. Gradually, as the books become huge sellers, become notorious as well, there's a lot more interest. And Fleming starts playing various parties off against each other. Fleming goes to the Caribbean island with his friend Ivor Bryce in sort of '56 to explore a bird colony, which he then uses that information for the basis for the Dr. No novel. And Dr. No seeks the interest of a film producer, Henry Morgenthau, who wants to make a movie of Dr. No. At the same time, CBS tried to get Fleming to write a TV show called Commander Jamaica. None of these come to any fruition. So Fleming then goes away and writes the novel Dr. No. This will be important. A few years later, CBS also come calling, Columbia Broadcasting Systems, and they want Fleming to develop some TV shows. So Fleming writes a number of outlines, none of which come to fruition, but then he uses those outlines to write the short story collection For Your Eyes Only, which contains the eponymous For Your Eyes Only, From a View to a Kill, Quantum of Solace, the Hildebrand Rarity, and Risico. That comes out in 1960, but it's sort of written in 1959. So we've had various attempts to get these books into films or TV. By the mid-50s and late 50s, the books are a best-selling phenomenon in the UK and gradually around the world. And it's ironic that the books can't be sold. Fleming has a number of agents. Peter Jansen Smith, his literary agent here. He has Curtis Brown. He has North American Newspaper Association in America dealing with the rights, but they're all slightly muddled. Fleming sometimes half gives away the rights, but it doesn't quite work. Ultimately, he's very frustrated. So his friend Ivor Bryce says to him, why don't we make our own James Bond film? Let's get a team together and let's write and produce our own film specifically for the screen. So Fleming says, great. And he engages Ivor Bryce, has produced a film in 1959 with a young Irish filmmaker called Kevin McClory. And the film's called The Boy in the Bridge. It's a sort of art house, black and white movie, little scene, quite engaging. But they sit down in Jamaica and the Bahamas to write a James Bond film. Everything has been written about this thing. Fleming pairs up with Kevin McCloy, who knows the Bahamas very well, and also they engage a professional screenwriter, Jack Whittingham, and they all sort of knock around ideas in '59. And towards the end of that period, I think Fleming sort of says, you know what, I need to go off and do something else. He gets bored. He goes off around the world and writes Thrilling Cities. Meanwhile, McClory and Bryce, McClory and Whittingham complete the screenplay, James Bond, I think it's Latitude 78, various things it's called, James Bond of the Secret Service. And nothing comes of it. Bryce says, you know what, I don't think it's going to work. I think they briefly think about getting Alfred Hitchcock to film it. And Fleming, like he's done with Commander Jamaica, like he's done with the short stories that end up being 4 hours only, he comes back and adapts this work into a novel, which he publishes in March 1961, Thunderball. And that's where Ian Fleming says, showbiz is ghastly biz, don't get caught in its ugly maw, grisly maw, because of course, McClory and Jack Whittam, quite rightly in my opinion, say, well, you plagiarized her work, you haven't given us any credit. So on comes a long court case, the outshot of which is that Kevin McClory retains the film rights to Thunderball, and Ian Fleming gets the gets to publish the novel, but with an acknowledgement of Jack Whittingham in Kevin McClory and Ian Fleming saying it's based on a screen treatment. This is in 1960. This is eventually in 1961 when the court case begins, and that's when Harry Saltzman comes a calling. Harry Saltzman is a Canadian film producer who's been in England for some time and famously produces the kitchen sink movies based on the new Angry Young Men writing of John Osborne and Tony Richardson at the Royal Court Theatre, and he's had some success. Harry Saltzman gets regional stars and create sort of iconic figures from them, Albert Finney and people like that, Tom Courtenay, to star in his movies. And he's Canadian, which is important. Harry Saltzman, during the war, worked in propaganda and intelligence and was based in the UK, at the Dorchester, in fact. And during the war, at the same time, that's exactly the area Ian Fleming was involved with German propagandas. John said he's a German speaker. He broadcasts propaganda in Bush House. And it is speculated by various people, but not confirmed, that Harry Saltzman and Ian Fleming may well have crossed paths in the intelligence services during the war in the same area. So when Ian Fleming gets introduced to Harry Saltzman by his solicitor, Brian Lewis, an option is sold for the books that are available at the time. This excludes Casino Royale, which is owned by Gregory Ratoff, as we know, and it excludes Thunderball, which is now owned by Kevin McClory. And Harry Saltzman famously partners with Albert R. Broccoli to form Eon Productions, and they vest the copyright in their Swiss-based company, Danjak, SA, and the Bond films are made in history. Ian Fleming's doesn't live, lives until 1964. As John said, he catches the first huge wave of success, but it's really after Fleming's death that the books are a massive, massive global sales success, even more than they were. Think Harry Potter, think Dan Brown, put them together, and you've got some sense of why the first Bond film says Ian Fleming's Dr. No and not anything else. That soon changed. Cape, who published the books, had a windfall. They're incredibly successful, and the English tax system being what it was in those days, they don't know what to do with this money. And eventually they use the money to form a literary prize, the Booker Prize in 1967 is the first Booker Prize, which is ironic because Fleming during his lifetime was sort of talked down by his wife Anne and by others, the literary set. And it was ironic that his money funded a prestigious literary prize. Glidrose Productions, who then owned the copyright to the books, realized that actually too valuable asset to go waste. So they sort of dipped their toe into continuation books. During Fleming's lifetime, his friend, the writer Cyril Connolly, writes a jokey short story called Bond Strikes Camp, which Glidrose buy in. It's the first official non-Fleming James Bond book, James Bond adventure rather. Glidrose then are behind The Adventures of 007 3.5 by R.D. Mascott. And then eventually they commission a continuation novel. This novel happens to be a book based on ideas discussed in correspondence with Ian Fleming by a South African thriller writer called Geoffrey Jenkins. And the resulting book, Per Fine Arts, is purchased by Glidrose Productions, but for reasons much speculated on, is suppressed and not published. And very soon afterwards, Glidrose then commissioned Kingsley Amis, and writing under the name Robert Markham, to write the first continuation Bond novel, Colonel Sun. which is released in 1968 to much acclaim. It's an extremely good book. Glidrows have a valuable literary property on their hands, and throughout the 70s, they sporadically exploit it. They get John Pearson, the aforementioned biographer of Fleming, to write a very cleverly written fictional biography of James Bond, the authorized biography. And then in the 70s, Christopher Wood writes two very Fleming-esque novelizations of the films Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me. Under Fleming's will, no film adaptation could be made of his experimental novel, The Spy Who Loved Me. So Christopher Wood has fun putting some Fleming into the book he calls James Bond, The Spy Who Loved Me, which has a very nice first edition jacket by Bill Botten, keeping in line of the Fleming jackets. The first edition I bought from John's shop, nicking it from James Pickard's hands, which I'm quite proud of. There's a terrible in-joke there. Glidrows then commissioned in the 80s John Gardner to write a series of original Bond novels which take Bond into the 80s and which were adventurous and fun reading for schoolboys like myself. And then they go on to commission Raymond Benson, the first American Bond author who wrote the wonderful James Bond Bedside Companion. It's interesting that both Kingsley Amis and Raymond Benson are Bond authorities before they're commissioned to write Bond books. And then the situation goes dormant until Glidrows become Ian Fleming Publications. Just a word about Ian Fleming Publications. Ian Fleming had to sell 50% of the rights to avoid tax just before he died, and it's owned by Booker McConnell, this large agrarian concern. And the Fleming family were famous and infamous and have drew wealth not from the Bond books, but from Ian's grandfather, Robert Fleming, for whom the motto "Let the deed show" was sort of emblazoned. And Robert Fleming was a merchant banker of great foresight, and he basically invested in the infrastructure in the United States. And around about the late 90s, Chase Manhattan buy Robert Fleming Bank for something in the region of $2 billion. And that allows the family to go back and set up their own trust and buy and get the ownership back of Glidrows Productions, and it becomes Ian Fleming Publications. And in 2008, they celebrate Ian Fleming's centenary wonderfully with a terrific exhibition at the Imperial Museum. And then they start getting a series of great authors, starting with Sebastian Faulks' Devil May Care. They get Jeffrey Deaver to write Carte Blanche, William Boyd to write Solo, and then eventually Anthony Horowitz to write Trigger Mortis, Forever and a Death, and the new Bond book, which is coming, I believe, May next year. So the literary heritage has a direct family connection to Ian Fleming, which is, again, unheard of, I think, in modern publishing. And that's the through line. But it all begins with, arguably, the films have kept the Bond brand going, but it's very interesting to see that the literary brand is still going in its own right with the Young Bond books, the Moneypenny Diaries, the comic books. It's a vibrant, distinct brand from what you see on the films. I urge everybody, if you've only seen a Bond film, which is quite natural, pick up an Ian Fleming book, pick up any of the books. They're wonderfully exciting, thrilling adventures with a character and finesse all of their own. And I hope if you can then wend your way to first editions and visit the Lilly Library, I think you'll be doubly rewarded. Thank you.
I think this is a perfect opportunity to go to Q&A. So I will get some questions. We have some questions from the audience already in the Q&A box. But if anyone else wants to ask something, you can go at the bottom of the screen, hit the Q&A button, or you can put it in the chat and we'll try to grab it from in there. After whom did Fleming base his characters, like Pussy Galore? So whoever wants to take that.
John, your microphone. No.
John, you're muted.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah. Now you're not.
Thank you. Yes, very good question. Thank you for that. Fleming based a lot of his characters on people that he knew. He took names from registers, guest books in restaurants, or famously the school roll had a chitty major and a chitty minor. As for Pussy Galore, I don't particularly have a basis for Pussy Galore. Honey Rider, we do have a basis for Honey Rider. There are certain characters, you know, we know all about. Bond uses the alias Bryce in Live and Let Die, and of course, you know, Bryce has cropped up a number of times today. Percy Muir, Fleming's bookseller, who supplied all those wonderful first editions. He is the station head in Geneva on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So there's an awful lot of characters that are, you know, directly lifted from either in name or in personality, are lifted from Fleming's life and background. Sadly, I don't have a story for Pussy Galore. I'd love to, but I don't have that.
John, I think Fleming jokes that he's based Pussy Galore on Blanche Blackwell at one point, but it's just
correct?
a joke. Yes, yeah.
I think well, we should explain that Blanche Blackwell was a close companion of Ian Fleming. In fact, her family or her roots were the Cross and Blackwell food giants, and they owned the large area, the plantation next to Fleming's land on Goldeneye, and they had a very close relationship towards the end of his life, which is another aspect I've not even touched upon. Fleming and his wife Anne had a very interesting view on their relationship and marriage, and both, you know, it's fair to say, conducted a number of extramarital affairs. So Blanche Blackwell was somebody very dear to Fleming. She lived to the age of over 100. I did have some email correspondence with Blanche, sadly before she died. But yeah, she's a key figure in Fleming's life, and I can see he would joke about Pussy being based on Blanche. She was quite feisty, wasn't she? She
was feisty, and Blanche Blackwell, of course, was the mother of Chris Blackwell, who was a production hand on Dr. No, but a big music fan, and formed Island Records, which, you know, brought Bob Marley to fame and U2 and other bands. And Chris Blackwell sold Island Records for multiple millions and bought Goldeneye eventually. And Chris Blackwell is the current owner of Goldeneye. So it's a lovely symmetry, I think.
Yes, yeah.
I think a lot of things in Fleming land have that nice symmetry to them.
I always say there's a 6 degrees of separation. You can always find a link to Fleming. Bob Marley, Sting wrote, you know, the famous song "Every Breath I Take" at the writing desk of Ian Fleming at Goldeneye. So, thanks for that question.
Someone wants to know if Ian had any children. So this feels like maybe a good.
Yes, Ian had a son, Caspar, his only son. Caspar was born in 1953, I believe, and as I said, the famous story Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which became the book, were adventures that Ian, you know, made up and read as bedtime stories to his son Caspar, while Ian sadly was at the end of his life and was recovering from one of his many heart attacks. Very sadly, Ian died on Caspar's 11th birthday, which is, you know, is a very poignant and you know, memorable thing. And Caspar died young as well, so, you know, some sadness there, in fact, but out of that, at least, you know, we have this wonderful book, Chitty, which is, I think is a beautiful book. I would encourage anybody to read it, you know, for themselves or to their kids. One of my favorite quotes from the entire writings of Ian Fleming isn't from the James Bond series. Ian writes in Chitty, "Never say no to adventures, otherwise one may lead a dull life." And I think that not only sums up Fleming, But it epitomizes the chitty book as well. Be brave.
Exactly.
Rebecca, someone wants to know how the materials ended up at the Lilly.
Sure. The roots of that really have to do with the antiquarian book trade. So this is kind of an appropriate venue for that question, because David Randall, who was the first director of the Lilly Library, or he was actually called the Lilly Librarian, was in the trade, Scrivener bookstore, before he became a librarian. So he had been for decades very involved in the antiquarian book trade and knew everyone. Knew Percy Muir. They were very good friends, and he had his eye on this collection for many years. He was not that interested in the typescripts. That was sort of a bonus. He was very interested in the book collection, and as soon as Fleming died, Muir and Randall wrote to each other. Their letters crossed, actually. What's happening? We're very sad, but what's happening to the books? It took years for the deal to be worked out. Anne Fleming seriously considered an auction, which would have meant the collection would be dispersed. And she wanted to make money, understandably, fair enough, from the sale, and was eventually persuaded that the best way to sort of reliably make money would be to sell them as a collection to a library. The final sale was $150,000, also like an incredibly small amount of money for when you think about what these could potentially be. I mean, they're just priceless today, especially considering the original typescript and manuscript material. But yeah, it took years to work out. Lots of negotiation, lots of will to make it happen. There is also this interesting other Fleming Lilly connection in that there was an exhibition in 1963 called Printing and the Mind of Man. That was this very important, famous exhibition about sort of all of the books that have changed the history of thought. And Fleming was one of the biggest private lenders to that exhibition. He lent, I think, 44 books. And the Lilly Library was one of the biggest institutional lenders. So it really, our collections do complement one another. It was kind of a logical home in some ways. And I'll also just mention, for anyone else who wants to sort of read about this history, the best kind of brief but thorough and very readable account was published in The Book Collector in spring 2017 by my director and friend Joel Silver, who knows a lot about this collection. He's written this whole history in an article called Books That Started Something. So that's a great place to look. Also, Percy Muir wrote about the collection in The Book Collector in spring 1965. And I highly recommend that article as well, especially just for some great anecdotes about Ian from a sort of bookish perspective.
Could I possibly just add one thing? Have we got image number 12? Can we bring that up? Which Rebecca might find very interesting. So, as mentioned, number 12. So Ian, obviously, or after Ian's death, the Lilly acquired the whole collection. There are a few copies that have come out on the open market over the years. Now, Ian was in the practice, sometimes he forgot that he had a copy of a certain book, or occasionally he might buy an improved copy, perhaps an inscribed copy of a book that he had that was unsigned, something like that.
That's our fault, actually. We sold, the Lilly sold some of the books. So yeah, they came from us. Back, at that time in the 1970s, it was considered kind of selfish for libraries to have two copies of really important books. So, for example, we already had J.K. Lilly Jr.'s copy of Darwin's On the Origin of Species. We got Fleming's copy. We sold Fleming's copy, which it horrifies me. I wish we had it. But at that time, that was very normal, standard practice. So yes, there are absolutely Fleming books that do come up on the market and are out there in other institutions' private hands and so on.
I was just trying to say to collectors and viewers out there, it gives us hope that if you want to try and own the smallest portion of Ian Fleming's collection, there are occasionally copies that surface. This is one that I have, or Adrian Harrington, my firm, has in conjunction with a partner bookseller, Lucius Books. This is a book on an important Edwardian text on heart surgery. So these books do surface, and as Rebecca said, perhaps they were sold off when they were duplicates, or but there's some interesting stories, and I know of about 5 or 6 copies out there, so it really isn't many at all, but we live in hope.
We have 3 more questions, so we can maybe rapid fire through them. This one I think is for AJ. What's the story about the David Nevin Casino Royale movie? How did it escape from the Broccoli production, and how did it eventually make it back?
Right, I saw that, yes. Ian Fleming had sold his rights to Casino Royale, and they ended up with a chap called Gregory Ratoff, who tries to make a film in the 50s. At some point, Gregory Ratoff passes away, and his widow has these wonderful rights, which are now getting more valuable because the Dan Jack films are being made. And Cubby Broccoli tries to get the rights from her, but she's advised not to sell the rights by Gregory Ratoff's agent, who happens to be a man called Charles K. Feldman. And Charles K. Feldman had previously, ironically, employed Cubby Broccoli and was a huge super agent. And eventually Charles K. Feldman buys the rights, and it's Charles K. Feldman who produces the gluttonous 1967 all-star spoof Casino Royale for Columbia Pictures. The film lies dormant. The rights are then held by Columbia for a long, long time, until 1999, when something strange happens. The man who helped resurrect Bond at the films, MGM, a man called John Calley, leaves MGM and joins Sony Pictures, which is the parent company of Columbia Pictures. And in leaving, he says, I'll set up a rival Bond franchise, because he knows all the ins and outs of this last remaining Bond thing. And as a result of a court case where MGM say, they don't question the rights, they say John Calley misused information. In the settlement, Sony have to give the rights back to Casino Royale to MGM. And it's ironic that when the film gets made, Casino Royale is, the MGM has been co-financed by Columbia, by Sony. So somehow Sony end up making it. And a few years later, Kevin McClory passes away after trying to remake his Thunderball rights, and then the Broccoli family buy back the rights from the McClory family. So that's why you have Blofeld and Spectre, which are part of the Thunderball saga. That's why all the Bond film rights are under one territory. And James Bond, by the way, is named after the ornithologist, James Bond, the book of which Fleming used in Jamaica. I can see another question there.
Someone wants to know if The World Is Not Enough, a biography of Ian Fleming by Oliver Buckton, is the book that you had meant, the new biography that you had mentioned, John.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The book I alluded to has not come out yet, but
okay.
It's in my opinion, it's going to be the along with the Pearson book from '66. 30 years on, we have Andrew Lycett's book, and now 30 years since that one, it'll be one of the trilogy of great book-length biographies. And I'm not diminishing The World Is Not Enough at all, but I believe those 3 are the, will be the. What would be nice about this forthcoming book is that a lot has happened, as AJ alluded to, the whole aspect of Casino Royale being filmed by Eon rather than the the original Charles K. Feldman version. That's happened since the Andrew Lycett book. So there are those aspects. Bond is always developing, and we have new Bond stories. We have retrospective things. We've got things coming out all the time, graphic novels, comic strip adaptations, this sort of thing, video games. So this new biography will cover obviously the life of Fleming, and there'll be lots of important interviews, etc. but it'll be covering things that have happened in the Bond world since, you know, in some detail, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And the only reason I'm possibly sounding like I'm pushing this book, this is a book that's been sanctioned by Ian Fleming Publications. So, you know, when you've got Ian Fleming Publications behind you, you have, you know, access to some incredible archive and material. So, you know, I'm really looking forward to this one. I wish I could give you more details, but it's not my place to do that. But
John, I understand. I know the bulk of which you speak. I shan't spoil it, but I get the impression they've left no stone unturned.
Yeah.
And I think I'd like to add that the Fleming archive was sort of itty bitty until the Fleming family took over, and I think they've done a very good job of collating and archiving professionally stuff that had been sort of put to the force winds before. So I think, I mean, I love Andrew Lycett's book. I love John Pearson's book, but I think in a way this book is going to do things those books could not do. Also, after the secrecy laws, a lot has come to light about the wartime exploits of Fleming and a lot of 30-year rule things. So I think this book is going to be something that no book previous could do. And as you say, it's sort of sanctioned by IFPL, and I think the writers very, very competent at what they do. So, you know, I think it's going to be the biography to end all Ian Fleming biographies.
yes.
Great. Okay, last question. Who do you think will be in the next, who do y'all think will be the next James Bond for movies?
Over to AJ.
If anyone here answered that question, they don't deserve to be on this panel because nobody knows. I strongly suspect they haven't even started looking yet for various complex reasons. I think the Amazon buyout precludes money being developed or spent on something, but I suggest they're waiting in the wings. It's going to be traditional casting, won't be something particularly unusual, young enough to star in a series of films, and with the Goldilocks amount of fame, not too famous, not unknown, but just famous enough. And whoever it is will go, of course they should be James Bond, but it won't be obvious to anyone. That's my prediction. And I'm willing to be completely wrong, as all predictions of this nature usually are.
I would merely add that I have great faith in the producers, Eon. They consistently, for me anyway, seem to come up with the right sort of choice. So I'm just looking forward, you know, to the next however many years. Long may it continue as a fan.
Rebecca, any guesses?
I promised I wouldn't talk about the movies. Definitely not a guess. Preference for me would be a woman, but I realize I'm probably in the minority in this particular room on that one.
I would. By the way, I agree in part with you. My sort of standpoint on the situation is there can be a female 007. 007 is an agent. 007 is a number. So there is a role of 007. And by all means, absolutely, 007 can be female. Clearly, a James Bond is a male character, but there could be a 007 movie and it could have a female lead and absolutely fantastic, you know.
I just want to see the new film, No Time to Die, which is scheduled for release on the 30th September, fingers and everything else crossed. And then let's cross that bridge when we come to it. I think it's a little too early to tell.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your expertise and for, you know, giving us an amazing panel on a Friday about Ian Fleming's James Bond. We hope to see you all at the virtual book fair. Please go to transatlanticbookfair.com. And if you're able to join us tomorrow, we have a second panel on fashion and antiquarian books. Thank you all. Have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and be safe.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.